On the morning of February 7th, 1983, in a wood-paneled law office in the small town of Fairbury, Nebraska, a young man walked into a conference room carrying a leather portfolio that contained a single sealed envelope, and he sat down at a long oak table among 4 other bidders, and the 8 years of silence that he had been carrying since he was 14 years old were about to come to their end. There were 9 people in that conference room. 2 of them were the surviving siblings of a farmer named Orville Talliver, who had died the previous October. One of them was a notary public from the courthouse in Fillmore County. 4 of them were competing buyers men ranging in age from their 40s through their 60s, who had driven in from Lincoln and Hastings and Crete and Omaha, expecting to walk out as the new owners of 480 acres of some of the best dryland farm ground in south-central Nebraska. One of them was the estate attorney himself, a man named Cyril Mercer, who was about to do something he had done 140 times in 26 years of practice, and who had no idea, sitting there with his folder of envelopes, that he was about to do it for the most extraordinary buyer he would ever process in his career. The 9th person in that room was a young man in good work clothes whose hands were folded quietly in his lap. His name was Silas Brandt. He was 22 years old. He was the eldest son of a small farmer who lived 4 miles east of the Talliver place. He had no inheritance behind him. He had no trust fund. He had no banker on the other end of a phone line ready to wire money. He had earned over the course of 8 years in deposits ranging from $40 to $400, beginning when he was 15 years old, and ending the week before he had walked into Cyril Mercer's office, the only thing he had ever needed to earn. The men around that oak table had thought, when the door opened and Silas walked in, that he was just a kid. They were technically correct about his age. They were also about to be wrong about everything else. This is the story of a boy who decided something at 14 and kept that decision in silence for 8 years until he could make it real. It is the story of what a young man can do in this country when he understands before most boys his age understand anything, that the most powerful thing a person owns is not money or land or even time. It is the ability to keep his mouth shut about what he intends to do until the moment when the thing he has been doing in silence finally has to speak for itself. If that sounds like the kind of story you want to hear, you are on the right channel. Stay with us. Now, let me take you back to the summer of 1974, because you cannot understand what Silas Brandt did in 1983 without first understanding the night that decided everything. It was the 2nd week of July. The county had been in a stretch of heat that had not broken in 11 days. The Brandt house sat on the edge of 160 acres of corn ground that Silas's father, Merrill Brandt, had been working since 1958. The corn was tall. The wells were holding. From the outside, in the long evening light, the place looked exactly like every other small operation in Fillmore County in the middle of the 1970s. Inside, it did not. Silas was 14 years old. He slept in a small room on the 2nd floor with a window that opened over the back porch. The heat that night had been the kind that did not let go after sundown. The air in his room had thickened against the ceiling, and at some point past 11 o'clock, he had given up on sleeping and was lying flat on top of the sheets, staring at the slow turn of a metal fan in the corner. He could hear his younger brother Jonas breathing slowly in the next room. Jonas was 11. Jonas could sleep through anything. What Silas heard next was the back door opening, then the sound of 2 chairs being pulled out at the kitchen table directly below his window. He had not meant to listen. He had only meant to lie there in the heat and wait for sleep that was not coming. But the kitchen window below his was open, and the back porch was open, and the voices that came up to him through the still summer air were so clear that he could not have stopped hearing them, even if he had tried. His mother spoke first. Her name was Adela Brandt, and she had been his mother for 14 years. and Silas had known her voice in every register a voice could take. But he had never before heard the particular sound that came out of her that night. It was not crying. It was the sound a person makes when crying would be a relief, and the relief is not available. She said the letter from the bank had come that afternoon. Merrill Brandt did not respond for a long time. When he did, he said only that he had seen it. Adela said the rate had gone up again. She said the new payment was almost $300 more a month than the one before. She said she did not see how they were going to make it work. She said she had been doing the numbers in the ledger for an hour, and the numbers did not move no matter how she looked at them. There was another long silence. Then Merrill Brandt said something that Silas Brandt would carry with him for the rest of his life. He said 16 years of work and we still don't own the ground we sleep on. There was a chair scraping. There was the sound of a man placing both hands flat on a wooden table. And there was after that the sound of Adela Brandt finally letting the relief come in the kitchen of the house her husband had not been able to buy in 16 years, while her 14-year-old son lay above her in the dark and listened. Silas did not move. He did not breathe in any way that could have been heard. He stared at the slow turn of the metal fan in the corner of his room, and somewhere inside him, a thing happened that did not have a name yet. He did not understand it as a decision. It would take him years to understand it that way. What he understood that night, lying flat on his back in the heat with his hands at his sides, was something simpler and harder. He understood that whatever had been making his mother sound the way she sounded, whatever had been pressing on his father's shoulders for 16 years, whatever was finally cracking open in the kitchen. Below him, he was going to spend the rest of his life making sure it never happened to him, not better than his father. He did not think of it that way. His father was a good man, working hard and honestly, and Silas knew this and would never stop knowing it. He simply meant that he was going to live a different kind of life from this one, a life with more ground under his feet, a life where the ground was paid for, a life where when somebody knocked at the door with a letter from a bank, he would not have to sit down at the kitchen table at midnight and explain to his wife how they were going to keep the lights on. He did not know yet how. He only knew that he was going to do it. The next morning, he woke up at 5:30. He ate breakfast with his family. His mother was wearing the same apron she always wore, and she did not look at him any differently. And his father drank his coffee in the same brown ceramic cup he had been drinking out of since before Silas was born. Nobody mentioned the kitchen table. Nobody mentioned the letter from the bank. By the standards of how the Brandt family handled difficulty, this was normal. Difficulty was a thing you absorbed in private the way the ground absorbs rain, and you did not talk about how wet the ground was getting unless you had to. After breakfast, Silas got on his bicycle and rode east on the gravel of County Road 14. He rode for about 20 minutes. He did not know where he was going when he started. He rode the way a boy rides when something has shifted inside him in the night, and he needs the moving air on his face to make it real. He came to a stop at a fence corner that he had passed perhaps 200 times in his life. On the other side of the fence, 480 acres of dryland winter wheat ran out to the western horizon in a long, unbroken stretch of green and gold. He had known this farm all his life. It belonged to a man named Orville Talliver and his wife Lavinia, neither of whom had any children. The Tollivers were the kind of people the county did not talk about much, because they did not give the county anything to talk about. They worked their land. They paid their bills. They went to the same Methodist church on Sunday morning. They did not, as far as anyone knew, have an unkind opinion or a public argument or a personal failing that any of their neighbors could remember. Their farm, on the other hand, was the kind of farm a man could remember. Silas stood astride his bicycle on the shoulder of County Road 14 and looked at it for a long time. He noticed things he had not noticed before. He noticed that the wheat in the foreground was a slightly different green from the wheat at the far edge of the field, which meant Orville had used different seed varieties or different planting dates, which meant Orville knew things about his ground that other farmers did not know. He noticed the windbreak of cedars on the northwest corner of the south paddock, planted in straight rows, mature now, doing the quiet work that windbreaks do. He noticed the way the contour of the land swelled gently toward a high point in the middle, and then fell away again toward the road. And he noticed that the rows of wheat followed the contour exactly, which meant somebody had thought about the shape of the ground and had decided to farm with it instead of against it. He stood there until his legs got tired. Then he laid the bicycle down in the ditch grass and sat on the fence rail and looked some more. What he was thinking while he sat on that fence rail in the August heat was a thing that did not yet have words. The closest words for it would not come to him until he was older. But the shape of it was this. Somewhere out there in front of him, 480 acres of well-kept dryland was sitting under the sun, owned by a man and a woman who had no children to leave it to. Somewhere out there in front of him was a piece of ground that in some future year that Silas could not yet see was going to be for sale. And on that day when it was for sale, somebody was going to walk in with the money and walk out with the ground. Silas decided, sitting on that fence rail, that the somebody was going to be him. He did not tell anyone. He did not tell his mother. He did not tell his father. He did not tell Jonas. He certainly did not tell Orville Talliver, who would have looked at the announcement of a 14-year-old boy's land ambitions with the same gentle skepticism with which an old farmer looks at a weather forecast in March. He just got back on his bicycle and rode home. That was the first morning of 8 years. Now let me tell you about the world that boy was riding home into, because 8 years is a long time, and the world Silas Brandt rode into in the summer of 1974 was a world that would test a quiet decision in ways that a 14-year-old boy could not yet imagine. Fillmore County in the middle 1970s was farm country in the most unsentimental sense of that phrase. It was not pretty country. It was rolling and open and brown and green by turns, and full of the kind of small towns that do not appear on the cover of any magazine. Exeter, where the Brandts banked. Geneva, the county seat. Strang and Ohiowa and the smaller places in between each, with a grain elevator and a co-op and a feed store, and a diner where the same 8 or 10 men sat at the counter every morning at 6 o'clock, with their hats on the seats next to them and the day's first cup of coffee in their hands. The men at those counters were almost without exception men who had spent their adult lives doing the same kind of work Merrill Brandt was doing. Some of them were doing it better. Some of them were doing it worse. A few of them, a small handful in any given town, had figured out something the others had not, and were quietly accumulating ground while everyone else was running in place. Most of them were running in place. Silas, in the year and a half after that morning at the fence line, began to pay attention to those men in a way that 14-year-olds do not usually pay attention to anything. He listened when his father talked at the supper table about who had bought what equipment and who was selling out and what the bank was charging this season. He listened at the elevator when he went there with his father. He listened at the feed store. He listened at church on Sunday morning when the men gathered in the gravel parking lot before the service and talked about prices and weather and whose son had taken over whose place. What he started to notice slowly was that the men who were getting ahead all had one thing in common. They were not always the smartest. They were not always the hardest working. They were not always the luckiest. The thing they all had was that they were not in debt the way the others were. Their land was paid for or close to it. Their equipment was paid for or close to it. When a bad year came, and a bad year came every 5 or 6 years, the men whose land was paid for absorbed it, the way you absorb a cold winter. The men whose land was leveraged absorbed it the way a thin paper absorbs water. He was 14 and then 15, and he was beginning to see the world the way a man sees the world. Not all of it. Not the way an old man sees it. But the part of it that mattered to him, which was the part that determined whether a family could keep what it had built. He started to save. It began on a Tuesday afternoon in May of 1975, when his father, Merrill Brandt, took him into the Exeter branch of the First National Bank of Nebraska to open his first savings account. Silas was 15. He had been baling hay for a neighbor for 2 weekends and had earned $38. He had ridden into town with his father in the pickup, and his father had said almost nothing on the drive because his father was a man who did not believe a moment was improved by talking through it. His mother had come along. Adela Brandt did not usually come into town for errands like this, but she had wanted to come that day. She had not said why. The man behind the counter at First National was a banker named Vance Holloway. Vance was in his middle 40s, a tall man with a thin mustache and the studied neutrality of a person whose job had taught him to keep his face mild, while saying the kind of things that ruined people's lives. Vance was the same banker who had written the letter that had come to the Brandt house the previous summer. Vance had sat across the desk from Merrill Brandt more than once over the years, and the conversations had not always gone the way Merrill Brandt had wanted them to go. Vance saw Silas standing at the counter with his 15-year-old hands folded over his 15-year-old wallet. Vance smiled the way bankers smile at children, which is to say with the upper half of his face only. And he said, "Well, son, what are we saving for today?" Silas said nothing for a second. Then he said, "Just saving." Vance smiled wider. He said, "Well, every man's got to start somewhere." He took the $38 and the co-signed form Merrill had filled out and processed the account. He handed Silas a small blue passbook with the bank's name in gold lettering across the front. He said, "You keep adding to that, son, and one of these days you'll have enough for a truck." Silas put the passbook in his pocket. He did not say anything to that. Outside in the gravel parking lot, his mother stopped him at the door of the pickup. His father had gone ahead to start the engine. Adela Brandt put one hand on her son's shoulder and turned him toward her, and Silas saw for the second time in a year the look on her face that he had heard but not seen on the night of the kitchen table. She said, "What are you saving for, son?" He said something. She said, "Will you tell me one thing then?" He said, "What?" She said, "When you have it, whatever it is, promise me it'll be paid for." Silas looked at his mother. He looked at the lines around her eyes and the way her hand had tightened on his shoulder, and he understood that what his mother was asking him for in that gravel parking lot on a Tuesday afternoon in May was the only thing she could think to ask him for. After 16 years of watching her own husband try to outrun a bank, he said, "I promise." She nodded once. Then she let go of his shoulder and got into the pickup, and they drove home, and his mother never asked him about the account again for as long as she lived. That promise became the spine of the next 8 years. He worked. He worked the way 15-year-old boys did not usually work in any era of American history. He baled hay for 3 farms in the district, including a place run by an old widower named Carl Hesterberg, who paid in cash at the end of every weekend in folded $20 bills that smelled faintly of pipe tobacco. He took weekend shifts at the grain elevator in Exeter, sweeping the floors and operating the small auger, and learning almost without meaning to the language that men used when they talked about wheat and corn and basis prices and hauling rates. He took on harvest work at 16, riding the buddy seat of a combine driven by a neighbor named Cal Trumbull. Then graduating at 17 to driving the combine himself for 2 operations whose owners had begun to trust him with their machines. He took care of equipment the way a careful man takes care of something he has borrowed. He returned every borrowed combine, every borrowed tractor, every borrowed truck in better condition than he had received it. He did this not because he was trying to impress anyone. He did it because he had understood almost by instinct that the relationships he was building with these older men were the foundation of every future thing he was gonna do, and that you do not damage the foundations of a future thing because you are tired or because nobody is watching. He did not spend the money. This was the part of his life that later, after the events of February 1983, became something that people in the county talked about in tones of slow and uncomprehending wonder, was the hardest for them to understand. He was a teenager in rural Nebraska in the late 1970s, with money in his pocket and almost no expenses, and no oversight beyond his own stubborn, quiet decision, and he did not spend it. He bought work clothes when his old ones wore through. He paid for his own fuel. He contributed to the household when his mother needed help and did not ask why. Everything else, every loose dollar, every unrouted bill, every weekend payment from Carl Hesterberg went into the small blue passbook with the gold lettering. By the end of 1976, when Silas was 16, he had $1,800 in the account. By the middle of 1977, when he was 17, he had $4,000 and change. He did not know yet what those numbers meant. He only knew that the line on the passbook was moving in the right direction, and that every time it moved, he was a little closer to the place he had decided to be on the morning of the bicycle ride. Now, here is where I have to introduce briefly a man you will come to know better. In the second part of this story, his name was Wendell Marsh. Wendell Marsh was 45 years old in the summer of 1974. He lived in Exeter in a 2-story house on the edge of town, with a wraparound porch and a Lincoln Continental in the driveway. He owned an insurance agency that handled half the farm policies in 3 counties, and he had begun in the early 1970s to acquire farmland on the side, taking advantage of the cash flow from the agency to pick up quarter sections and half sections from older farmers who were retiring or giving up. He had a wife named Roberta and 2 daughters who had both gone to college in Lincoln, and he had the particular kind of confidence that comes to a man who has succeeded at one thing in his life and has begun to assume on the basis of that one success that he must therefore be correct about everything. Silas had seen Wendell Marsh many times before the afternoon at the grain elevator. Wendell came through the elevator now and then on insurance calls. He came through the feed store. He came through the diner. He was in the small geography of Exeter and the surrounding county hard to avoid if you spent any time in town at all. The afternoon Silas would remember for the rest of his life happened in October of 1974. 3 months after the night of the kitchen table, Silas was riding into town with his father in the pickup. They stopped at the elevator to drop off 2 loads of corn. There were about a dozen men in and around the elevator that afternoon doing the loose business of fall, and Wendell Marsh was one of them. Wendell was standing in a cluster of 3 other men by the scale shack with a cigarette between 2 fingers, and the kind of slow, confident posture of a man who knew he was being listened to. When Merrill Brandt walked past the cluster on his way to the office, Wendell Marsh said something. He said it just loud enough that the men around him could hear it, and just loud enough that Merrill Brandt could hear it, and just quiet enough that Wendell could later, if challenged, claim that it had not been said for any particular audience at all. He said, "Brandt, when you finally lose that quarter, you let me know. I'll give you fair price." Silas was standing about 6 feet behind his father. He saw his father's shoulders. He saw the way Merrill Brandt's whole body did the thing it had done almost without moving on the night of the kitchen table. He saw the small, involuntary stiffening that runs through a man when a stone has been thrown, and there is no acceptable way to throw a stone back. He saw his father slow down almost imperceptibly, and then keep walking because keeping walking was the only honorable response a man like Merrill Brandt had available to him in that moment, in front of those men. Silas did not keep walking. He stopped where he was at the corner of the scale shack, and he looked at Wendell Marsh and his 14-year-old fists at the ends of his thin 14-year-old arms tightened so hard that his fingernails cut crescents into his palms. He could feel the warmth of the blood under the skin of his hands, and he could hear the slow, steady hum of the elevator behind him, and he could see the small, mocking smile on the corner of Wendell Marsh's mouth. And he understood several things at once. He understood that he had been wrong on the night of the kitchen table about why he was going to do what he was going to do. He had thought that night that he was doing it for himself. He had thought he was doing it so that he would never have to sit at his own kitchen table at midnight and explain to his own wife how the bills were going to get paid. He understood, watching his father absorb that public sentence and keep walking, that the real reason was older and harder and deeper than that. He was doing it so that no man who looked like Wendell Marsh in any year of his life would ever again be able to throw a stone at his father in a public place and make his father's shoulders do what they had just done. He looked at Wendell Marsh for another second. Wendell Marsh did not see him looking because men like Wendell Marsh do not see boys of 14 as a category that requires looking at. Then Silas turned and walked after his father, and he did not say a word about what had happened, and he did not say a word for the rest of the drive home, and he did not say a word to his father about Wendell Marsh ever for the next 9 years. What he carried home from the elevator that afternoon, riding in silence in the passenger seat of his father's pickup with the corn dust still on his arms, was a thing colder and more permanent than the decision he had made on the morning of the bicycle ride. The decision on the bicycle had been about wanting something. The decision in the pickup was about something else. It was not exactly revenge. Revenge was too small a word for what it was. It was the decision that there was a way of standing in the world, a way of placing your boots on the ground in front of a man like Wendell Marsh that did not depend on what you said to him. And he was going to learn that way of standing, and he was going to be standing that way one day in a room that mattered. And Wendell Marsh was going to be in that room. He did not tell anyone. He just kept saving. By the spring of 1977, Silas was 17 years old and had begun working part-time at the Exeter grain elevator under the supervision of a man named Lloyd Pickett, who had been running the place for 30 years, and who liked Silas because Silas did not waste words and did the work in front of him with the kind of finishing care that Lloyd had come to associate in his old age with men who were going to be all right in life. It was at the elevator on a Wednesday afternoon in late June of that year that Silas had his first real conversation with Orville Talliver. Orville came in to weigh a load of Milo. Silas was in the office helping Lloyd with the ticket book. Orville stood at the counter with his cap in his hands. He was 68 years old then. His face had the slow weathering of a man who had spent 5 decades outside without complaining about it. He greeted Lloyd by name as he always did. He greeted Silas with a small nod as he had done a few times before, recognizing him as the boy of one of the smaller farmers down the road, but not particularly noting him as anything else. Then Orville did something that surprised Silas. He turned to him and asked a question. He asked Silas if he knew why the new shipment of Milo coming through that month was running about 3 points lighter on test weight than the previous years, even though the rainfall numbers had been comparable. Silas thought about it for a moment. He had been listening to Lloyd and the older farmers talk for 2 years now. He had been reading the agricultural extension bulletins that came in the office mail. partly because he was curious, and partly because there was nothing else to read on slow afternoons. He had been paying attention to the way the men he respected talked about test weights and grain quality and the difference between moisture content and density. He gave Orville his answer. He said it had not been the rainfall. The rainfall had been similar. It had been the timing of the rainfall. The previous year, the moisture had come early and stopped before the grain fill. This year, the moisture had come during the grain fill. The grain had filled fast and not had time to set proper density, so the kernels were the same size but lighter, which was why the test weights were running off. Orville Talliver did not say anything for a moment. Then he asked Silas where he had learned that. Silas said he had been listening. Orville Talliver looked at the 17-year-old boy in front of him for a long moment. He did not smile. He did not ask another question. He took his weight ticket from Lloyd and he put his cap back on his head. And he nodded once at Silas. And he walked out of the office and got into his pickup and drove away. Lloyd Pickett behind the counter watched him go. Then he looked at Silas with an expression Silas did not entirely understand at the time. Lloyd said that man does not stop and ask things of 17-year-old boys. Silas said, "No, sir." Lloyd said, "You remember that." Silas said he would. He went home that night and sat on the porch as the heat of the day went out of the air. And he thought about the conversation, and he wrote down everything Orville had asked and everything he had answered in a small spiral notebook he had begun to keep in the drawer of his bedside table for reasons he could not yet articulate. He did not know it then, but Orville Talliver had also gone home and sat on his own porch. And Orville had also been thinking about that conversation in a way, and for reasons that Silas Brandt would not understand until much later in this story. Have you ever decided something at 14 years old that the adults in your life would have laughed at if you had told them? And have you ever wondered if you had decided such a thing, what it would have cost you to keep it in silence for the next 8 years, while the world around you went on assuming that you were nothing more than what you appeared to be on the surface? Drop a comment and let me know, because Silas Brandt was about to find out. By the autumn of 1978, Silas was 18 years old, and the small blue passbook in the drawer of his bedside table had become a different kind of object. It had crossed $14,000. He no longer carried it in his pocket. He no longer needed to. The number on the line was no longer an aspiration. It had become a thing that existed, a steady accumulating fact, a quiet weight in the bottom drawer of a teenage boy's nightstand that nobody who walked into that room would have known was there. That fall on a Saturday in late October, Silas was crossing the gravel of the town center in Exeter on his way to the hardware store when he passed the front of the diner and saw through the plate glass window Wendell Marsh sitting at the counter with 3 other men. Wendell was telling a story. The men around him were laughing. The light through the window made the whole scene look warm and easy and certain in the way that scenes look from the outside. When you are 18 years old and you are walking on the gravel and they are sitting on the stools. Wendell saw him through the window. Wendell did not stop talking. Wendell said something to the men around him, and they all turned and looked, and one of them laughed, and Wendell, with a wave of his coffee cup, called out through the open door of the diner. He said, "Brandt boy, still saving for that truck." Silas stopped on the gravel. He looked at Wendell Marsh through the door of the diner for one full second. He did not feel the heat in his hands that he had felt at the grain elevator 4 years before. He did not feel anything, in fact, that he could put a name to. What he felt was a kind of stillness. The particular stillness of a young man who has been carrying a decision in silence for 4 years now, and is beginning to understand that the silence is not a burden. It is a position. It is the place from which everything else will eventually be possible. He did not say anything to Wendell Marsh. He nodded once. It was not the nod of a young man acknowledging a man older than himself. It was a different kind of nod, slower and more level. And Wendell Marsh, watching it from his stool in the diner, felt for the first time the small, uncomfortable suggestion that he might not actually understand what he was looking at. Then Silas turned and kept walking. Some men measure themselves by what they say to their enemies. Silas Brandt had decided by the autumn of 1978 to measure himself by what he did not say. He had 4 more years of silence ahead of him. He had no idea walking past the diner that afternoon how much those 4 years were going to cost him before they were done. Now let me tell you what 8 years of silence actually costs a man. Because most people who hear a story like this imagine the silence as patience. It is not patience. Patience is a quiet word for a soft thing. The silence that Silas Brandt had committed himself to on the morning of the bicycle ride was not soft. It was a series of losses he was going to have to accept on purpose, one at a time, year after year, while the people he loved most in the world made their own decisions about who he was, based on the only information they had available, which was the surface of him. The first of those losses had a name. Her name was Maren Whitlock. In the spring of 1979, Silas was 19 years old. He had just finished his last year of high school in Exeter the previous May, and instead of going to the community college in Hastings, the way some of his classmates had done, he had taken on a 5th job. He was now working 5 days a week at the elevator under Lloyd Pickett, 2 evenings a week as a mechanic's helper at a small implement shop in Strang, and weekends in season on harvest crews and hay crews wherever he was needed. He was earning more in a week than most boys his age earned in a month. He was depositing all of it. The passbook in his bedside drawer had crossed $27,000 by April. Maren Whitlock was 18. She had grown up 4 miles south of the Brandt place on a quarter section of corn ground that her father, Earl Whitlock, had been farming since before she was born. She had brown hair that she wore in a braid down her back when she was working, and loose around her shoulders when she was not. She had been in Silas's class at the Consolidated School in Geneva from the 7th grade through their senior year. She had not particularly noticed him in any of those years. He had not particularly given her anything to notice. That changed in the spring of 1978, the year before, when Silas had taken her to the senior banquet at the school in May. He had not asked her with any particular plan in mind. He had asked her because his mother had said gently at the kitchen table one evening that the banquet was something a young man went to with a young woman, and that she would like very much to see her son go to it, and that there was a girl named Maren Whitlock whose family went to the same Methodist church, and who Adela thought might say yes if Silas asked. Silas had asked. Maren had said yes. They had gone. And in the small, careful way that things sometimes start in small towns where everyone has known everyone since childhood, something had begun between them. By the spring of 1979, they had been seeing each other for almost a year. She was the first girl Silas had ever loved. She was possibly the first girl he was ever going to love. She knew the shape of his hands and the sound of his footsteps on the porch of her father's house. And she had begun in the slow, honest way that young women begin such things to imagine a future, in which the footsteps on the porch belonged to her own life and not to her father's. In April of 1979, on a Sunday afternoon, they took a walk along the gravel road that ran between his parents' place and her parents' place. The wheat in both directions was just turning the deep spring green that it turned before it began to head out. The air was warm, They were holding hands. Maren stopped at a fence corner and looked up at him, and she said something that in the language of 19-year-old young women who have been raised in farm country was as close as she could come to asking him directly what he intended to do with the rest of his life. She said, "Silas, I keep wondering what you're working so hard for." He looked at her. He saw the trust in her face. He saw the small openness that he had earned over a year of treating her with the careful respect he had been raised to give. He saw behind the question the real question, which was whether she had a place in the answer. He had a choice in that moment. He could have told her. He could have said, "Maren, I am saving for a piece of ground. I have decided since I was 14 that I am going to own 480 acres of dryland east of the Brandt place. I have $27,000 in an account at First National. I have 8 more years of work to do. I want you to wait for me." He could have said any of that. He did not. Because the thing he had committed himself to on the morning of the bicycle ride, the thing he had committed himself to again on the afternoon at the grain elevator, was a silence that did not allow for explanations even to the people who deserved them. He had decided somewhere in the long working days of the previous 5 years that the silence was the discipline. That the moment he started telling people what he was doing, the doing of it began to soften and bend toward what those people thought of it. That the only way to keep the decision pure across 8 years of ordinary life was to keep it entirely his own. And so he said to Maren Whitlock at the fence corner on that warm April afternoon, the only thing he could say. He said, "I'm working for something I can't talk about yet." She waited for him to say more. He did not say more. He saw in the slow change in her eyes the moment she understood that he was not going to say more. She did not get angry. She did not push him. Maren Whitlock had been raised by Earl Whitlock to understand that there were some things a man would tell you, and some things a man would not, and that the second category was often more important than the first, and that a wise woman did not try to drag the second category into the light. She just nodded, slowly, once. Then she said, "Silas, I think you're a good man. I think you're one of the best men I've ever known. But I don't think I can spend my life waiting to find out what you can't talk about." He did not say anything to that. He walked her back to her father's house in silence. He did not hold her hand on the way back. At her father's gate, she turned and looked at him one more time, and there was something in her face that was not anger and was not blame, and was not even disappointment exactly. It was a kind of slow, honest sorrow, the sorrow of a young woman who had begun to imagine a life and was now letting the imagining go. She said, "Take care of yourself, Silas." He said, "You too, Maren." Then she went inside. 6 months later, in October of 1979, Maren Whitlock married a young man named Dean Pickering, who was the son of the John Deere dealer in Geneva. The wedding was held at the Methodist church that the Brandts and the Whitlocks both attended. Silas was there because not going would have made his absence the subject of more conversation than going. He sat in the back pew in the suit he had owned since his graduation. He watched her walk down the aisle in her mother's wedding dress. He kept his face the way he had taught himself to keep his face. He did not move. In the gravel parking lot afterward, during the receiving line, Wendell Marsh was there. Wendell knew the Pickerings socially. Wendell had insurance policies on the dealership. Wendell had a glass of champagne in his hand that he had brought outside from the reception, and he saw Silas standing alone by the fence at the edge of the parking lot, and he raised his glass across the gravel in a small, slow, mocking salute, and he smiled. Silas looked at him. He did not raise anything in return. He did not nod. He did not turn away. He just looked. Wendell, after a few seconds, lowered his glass. The smile stayed on his mouth, but it had become a slightly different smile, the smile of a man who had thought he understood a joke and had begun to suspect that the joke was not what he had thought it was. Silas turned and walked to his pickup and drove home. He did not cry that night. He did not cry the next night. He never cried about Marin Whitlock at all in any way that anyone who knew him would have been able to detect. What he did instead was open the bottom drawer of his nightstand and take out the small blue passbook with the gold lettering, and he looked at the line that read $29,418, and he sat with that number for a long time in the dark, and he made the decision that nobody else was ever going to know he had made. He had paid the first real price of the silence. He had not known until he paid it how much it was going to cost him. He understood now that there were going to be more prices. He decided, sitting on the edge of his bed in the late autumn of 1979, that he was going to keep paying them. The next price had a different shape. Its name was Jonas. Jonas Brandt was 16 years old in the autumn of 1979. He was the kind of younger brother who had spent his entire conscious life looking up at his older brother and trying to figure out what made him work. Jonas was not like Silas. Jonas was talkative and quick and easily wounded. He felt things on the surface of his skin in a way that Silas felt nothing on the surface of his skin. He was going to be, Adela Brandt had said more than once, the kind of man who would either build something extraordinary with his life or break himself trying. Jonas had been admitted to the University of Nebraska in Lincoln for the fall of 1981. He was going to study agronomy. He had earned the admission himself with the grades he had pulled in the consolidated high school in Geneva, and he was in the quiet way of the family, a source of pride to Merrill and Adela that they did not often say out loud. In the spring of 1980, the Brandt family found out that they could not afford to send him. The corn price had collapsed. The interest rate at First National had moved again, this time to 14% on the operating loan that Merrill carried season to season. The land payment had gone up. The fertilizer payment had gone up. The fuel payment had gone up. Everything had gone up except the price of the corn. By the end of March, after the books for the year had been done, Merrill Brandt had sat down at the kitchen table with Adela and gone through what they had and what they did not have, and what they did not have was the $8,000 it was going to take to send Jonas to Lincoln in the fall. Adela had told Jonas. She had told him gently, the way she told most hard things. Jonas had not taken it well. He had not yelled. He was not the kind of boy who yelled. He had gone out to the back porch and sat there for 2 hours, and he had not come in for supper. 2 days later, on a Thursday evening in early April, Jonas came into the workshop where Silas was rebuilding the magneto on a Farmall H. Silas did not stop working. He had learned in his years at the implement shop that the worst thing you could do with a piece of equipment was put it down halfway through the work in front of it. He kept his hands on the magneto. He looked up at his brother once and went back to the work. Jonas stood in the doorway of the workshop for a long time. The light behind him was the long, flat light of an April evening. Silas could feel his brother's presence the way you feel weather changing. Finally, Jonas said, "You have it, don't you?" Silas said, "What?" Jonas said, "The money. To send me to Lincoln. You have it." Silas did not look up. Jonas said, "I know you have it. I've watched you for 10 years. You don't spend money. You work like a man twice your age. Mom says you have an account she stopped asking about. Dad won't talk about it. But you have it." Silas put down the magneto wrench. He wiped his hands on a shop rag. He looked at his 16-year-old brother who was standing in the doorway with his fists at his sides and tears in his eyes that he was trying very hard not to let fall. And he understood that this was the moment that the second price of the silence was going to come due. He could have told Jonas. He could have said, "Brother, listen. There is a thing I am working toward. The money in that account is for that thing. If I take $8,000 out of it now, I lose another year of the timeline. I lose the cushion against the next bad year. I lose the margin that makes the whole thing possible. I cannot give you the $8,000. But here is why." He could have said all of that and Jonas would have understood. Jonas was 16, but he was not stupid. He would have understood. And he would have been hurt. But he would not have hated his brother. Silas could not say it. To say it to Jonas was to say it. To say it to anyone was to begin the unraveling of the silence that had become, at this point, the architecture of his entire interior life. So Silas said the only thing he could say. He said, "I'm sorry, Jonas. I can't help you with this." Jonas stared at him for several seconds. Then he said, "You can or you won't." Silas said, "I can't." Jonas said, "That's a lie." Silas did not answer. Jonas said, "You have the money and you're choosing not to give it to me and you can't even tell me why. You're going to let me lose this because you have something more important than your own brother's college. Is that right?" Silas said, "Jonas." Jonas said no. Don't say my name like that." He stood there for one more second and Silas saw in his brother's face the exact moment that something between them broke. It did not break loudly. Most things that break between brothers do not break loudly. Jonas's face changed. The tears that he had been holding back came down without his permission. He turned and walked out of the workshop. He did not speak to Silas again for almost 6 months. Silas finished rebuilding the magneto that evening. He installed it the next morning. He drove the Farmall H back to the implement shop in Strang and collected his pay, which was $84 for that week. And he deposited it in the account on Saturday morning. And he did not tell anyone ever that the deposit had felt different from any deposit he had made before. Jonas did not go to Lincoln in the fall of 1981. He went to the community college in Hastings instead on a partial work study. He lived at home. He drove an old pickup truck that Merrill had patched together out of parts. He did not look at Silas across the supper table for the first 3 months. Adela saw it and said nothing about it because Adela Brandt understood that whatever was happening between her 2 sons was a thing that they were going to have to work out themselves. Silas paid the second price. He kept saving. By the late autumn of 1980, the small blue passbook had crossed $41,000. He had been saving for 6.5 years. The 8 years he had set himself on the morning of the bicycle ride had begun to feel less like an abstract distance and more like a real one. Then his father came to the workshop. It was the first week of November. The corn had been in for 3 weeks. The cold had come early that year and there was already a hard rim of frost on the grass in the mornings. Merrill Brandt was 51 years old that fall, and Silas, who saw his father every day and had not really looked at him in a while, looked at him on the night Merrill walked into the workshop and saw for the first time how much his father had aged in the previous 5 months. Merrill had not knocked. He had not announced himself. He had walked into the workshop the way a man walks into a place he has been 100 times before, and he had sat down on the upturned milk crate that Silas used as a stool when he was not working, and he had not said anything for almost a full minute. Silas put his tools down. He waited. Merrill said, "I never asked you what's in that account, son." Silas said, "No, sir." Merrill said, "I'm not asking you now." Silas said, "All right." Merrill said, "What I'm doing is telling you what's happening to me." He did not look at Silas while he said it. He looked at the dirt floor of the workshop and at his own hands, which were the hands of a man who had worked outside for 35 years, and which had developed over those years a particular shape and a particular tremor that Silas had never noticed before that night. Merrill said the bank called this morning. Holloway. He told me they aren't going to roll the operating loan again next spring unless I pay it down by $32,000 before the 1st of February. He said it the way Holloway says things, polite, apologetic, like he was sorry to have to be the one to tell me. Silas did not say anything. Merrill said, "I don't have $32,000. I don't have a way to get $32,000. If I can't pay it down, the bank takes the operating note out from under me, and without the operating note, I can't put a crop in next spring, and without a crop next spring, we lose the place." He stopped. Then he said, "I am not asking you, son. I want you to understand that. I am not asking you for anything." Silas looked at his father. He did not say anything for a long time. He looked at Merrill Brandt's hands and at the slope of his shoulders, and at the slow, steady tremor that had not been there 5 months earlier, and had appeared now without any announcement. And he thought about the night of the kitchen table 6.5 years before. And he thought about the promise to his mother in the gravel parking lot of First National. And he thought about the line on the passbook that had reached $41,000 3 weeks earlier. And he understood that the third price of the silence had come due, and that this one was going to be larger than either of the first two. He said, "I understand." Merrill nodded. He stood up from the milk crate. He looked at his son once briefly, and Silas saw in his father's eyes the thing that Merrill Brandt would never have allowed himself to put into words. Not a request, not even a hope exactly. Just the small, terrible knowledge that the thing he had needed his whole life to be able to do, which was to handle his own difficulties without asking his children to carry them for him, had finally exceeded what he was able to do alone. Merrill walked out of the workshop into the cold November night. Silas did not move for almost an hour. When he finally stood up and walked across the yard to the house, the kitchen light was off, and the upstairs hall light was off, and his father had gone to bed. He went up to his own room and he sat on the edge of his bed in the dark, and he opened the bottom drawer of his nightstand and he took out the passbook. For the first time in 6.5 years, Silas Brandt cried. He cried not because he was afraid of losing the money. He cried because he had understood, sitting there in the dark with the passbook in his hands, that the entire structure of the thing he had been building was resting in some way he had not previously seen on his father's quiet, ongoing pain. He had told himself for 6.5 years that he was saving so that he would never have to live the way his father lived. He had not let himself see the other half of that sentence, which was that as long as his father went on living that way, the saving could continue. And the moment his father stopped being able to live that way, the saving would have to stop too. He had been building his own escape from a fire that his father was still standing inside. He cried for about 10 minutes with his hand over his mouth so that nobody in the house would hear him. Then he stopped. He put the passbook back in the drawer. He washed his face at the small basin in the corner of his room. He lay down on top of the bedclothes in his work clothes, and he stared at the ceiling, and somewhere in the long, cold hours before dawn, he made a decision that in its way was as important as the decision he had made at 14 on the bicycle. The decision was this: he was not going to give his father the $32,000. To give it to him would be to lose another 1.5 years of the timeline, and the timeline mattered because the timeline was the only thing standing between his future family and the fire his father was still standing in. But he was going to find another way to get the $32,000 into the operation. Not as a gift, not as a withdrawal, as something else. Something that would keep the money where it had to stay and still get his father what he needed. He did not know yet what that something was. He went to bed at 4 in the morning. He got up at 5:30. He ate breakfast with his family. His father was at the table in the brown ceramic cup. Nobody spoke about the workshop conversation. It had not happened by the rules of the Brandt family until somebody acknowledged that it had. That afternoon after work at the elevator, Silas drove east on County Road 14. He did not go home. He drove past the Brandt Drive and kept going 4 miles until he came to the long gravel lane that led up to the white 2-story farmhouse where Orville Taliver and his late wife Lavinia had lived for 40 years. Lavinia had died the previous spring in 1979. Orville had been alone in the house for almost 2 years. Silas had not spoken to Orville since the conversation about the Milo at the elevator 3 years earlier. He drove up the lane. He parked the truck. He walked up to the front porch and he knocked on the screen door. Orville came to the door in a wool cardigan and his work pants and his slippers with a coffee cup in his hand. And he looked at the 20-year-old man on his porch with no surprise at all, which was the first thing about that visit that Silas would remember years later, when he understood it differently. Orville said, "Silas Brandt." Silas said, "Mr. Taliver." Orville said, "Come inside. It's cold. Silas came inside. He sat at the kitchen table. Orville poured him a cup of coffee without asking. He sat down across from him. Silas said, "Sir, I have a question to ask you. It's not a small one." Orville said, "Ask it." Silas said, "My father is going to lose his operating note in February if he can't bring $32,000 to the bank. He doesn't know I'm here. He didn't ask me to come. I am asking you something he would not ask you and would not want me to ask you." Orville waited. Silas said, "You have 480 acres. You have been farming them alone since Mrs. Taliver passed. You are 71 years old, and you should not be doing all of that work yourself. My father is one of the best dryland farmers in this county, and he is going to be available in some capacity starting next spring. If you would consider hiring him to do custom work for you, the planting and the harvest, and whatever you would want him to do on a contract basis with payment up front for the season, at a fair rate, I believe he could earn the $32,000 he needs to bring to the bank in February, plus enough to live on through the year. He would be working for it, not borrowing it, not asking for it, working for it." Orville Taliver did not say anything for a long time. He looked at the 20-year-old man across his kitchen table, and he turned his coffee cup once in his hands, slowly, and Silas saw behind the steady gray eyes the first small recognition of something that he had not seen in those eyes before. He could not have said what it was. He only saw it. Orville said, "Why are you doing this, son?" Silas said, "Because he needs the money and he won't ask for it." Orville said, "Why are you doing it instead of just giving him the money yourself?" Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Sir, I would rather not answer that question." Orville Taliver looked at him for a few more seconds. Then he said, "All right. I won't ask it again." He stood up. He walked to a sideboard in the corner of the kitchen and took out a piece of paper and a pen. He wrote on the paper for about 3 minutes. He came back to the table. He slid the paper across to Silas. It was a contract. It was for $34,000 payable on the 1st of February 1981, in exchange for the spring planting, the fall harvest, and certain ongoing maintenance work on the Taliver property over the course of the 1981 calendar year. to be performed by Merrill Brandt under his own management. Orville said, "You take that to your father. Don't tell him you came here. Tell him I came to your place this morning while he was out, and you took the contract from me, and I'll back the story if anybody asks." Silas did not say anything. Orville said, "Do we have an understanding?" Silas said, "Yes, sir. We have an understanding." He stood up. He folded the contract into his pocket. He put on his cap. At the door, he stopped and he turned and he looked at Orville Tolliver one more time. He wanted to say thank you. He could not figure out how to say it in a way that did not collapse the thing they had just done into something smaller than it was. So he did not say it. He just nodded once the way Orville had nodded at him 3 years before in the office at the elevator. And he walked out to his pickup and drove home. Merrill Brandt signed the contract 2 days later. He told Adela that Orville Tolliver had come by while he was at the elevator and had offered him the work, and that he had thought about it and decided to take it. Adela had listened with her hands folded on the kitchen table, and she had not said anything for a moment. And then she had looked at her older son across the room where Silas was reading the agricultural paper at the counter, and she had not said anything to him either. But she had looked. Silas met her look. He did not say anything. After a moment, she went back to making the bread dough she had been working on, and the matter was, by the rules of the Brandt family, considered closed. In the spring of 1981, when Merrill went to do the first of the work on the Tolliver property, he never asked Orville about the contract. Orville never offered any information. The two men worked together for the next year and a half, in the way that two old farmers work together with very little said. Orville paid the contract on schedule. Merrill brought the $32,000 to First National in February, and Vance Holloway processed the paydown and rolled the operating note for another season, and the Brandt place was saved. And Silas Brandt's account at First National stood at $53,400 at the end of 1981, which was almost exactly where it would have stood if his father had never walked into the workshop in November of 1980. He had paid the third price. He had paid it differently from the way it had looked like it was gonna have to be paid. He had paid it by sacrificing not the money, but the pride of being the one who handed his father the rescue. He had paid it by letting another man do the visible part of the saving, while he, Silas, stayed where he had to stay, which was inside the silence with the timeline still intact. Now I want to tell you about the spring of 1981, because that was the spring that Wendell Marsh came to the Brandt place in person for the first and only time in his life. Silas was 21 years old that spring. He had been saving for nearly 7 years. The passbook had crossed $60,000 by April, and Silas had begun for the first time to allow himself to think in concrete numbers about what land in Fillmore County was actually worth. What he did not know, but what Wendell Marsh did know, was that Vance Holloway at First National had begun in the way that small-town bankers sometimes do, to mention things at the country club in Hastings on Saturday afternoons that he should not have been mentioning. Holloway had not mentioned the exact balance on Silas's account. He had mentioned in passing to a group of men that included Wendell Marsh that one of the more interesting customers at the Exeter branch was a young man on a small farm east of town who had been making deposits since he was 15 and who was now sitting on what Holloway called a substantial position for his age. Wendell Marsh had heard this. Wendell Marsh had put it together with what he already knew about the Brandt family. Wendell Marsh had thought about it for several weeks, and in the second week of April, on a Tuesday afternoon when Merrill was up at the Tolliver place doing custom planting and Adela was in town at the church, Wendell Marsh drove his Lincoln Continental out to the Brandt place and parked it at the end of the gravel drive and walked up to the workshop where Silas was rebuilding a hydraulic pump. Silas heard the car before he saw it. He came out of the workshop wiping his hands on a shop rag. Wendell Marsh was wearing a sport coat and slacks and good leather shoes, the kind of clothes a man wore for an in-town errand and not for a visit to a workshop. He was smiling the small, confident smile of a man who had thought through what he was going to say on the drive out. He said, "Silas Brandt. I don't think we've ever properly been introduced." Silas said, "No, sir." Wendell said, "My name's Wendell Marsh." Silas said, "I know who you are." Wendell paused for half a second. Something in the flat quietness of Silas's voice did not match what Wendell had been expecting. Wendell adjusted. He kept the smile on. Wendell said, "I won't take much of your time, son. I came out here because I had a thought I wanted to share with you. Vance Holloway and I were talking up at the club a few weeks back, and Vance mentioned very generally that you'd been doing well for yourself with your savings. He didn't say any numbers. I'm not asking you for any numbers. But I had a thought, and I wanted to bring it to you man to man." Silas said, "All right." Wendell said, "I have a piece of ground. 80 acres north of town came up in a probate situation last fall. It's a little run down. The soil's good. The fences need work. The house on it isn't worth saving. But the ground itself is solid, and I bought it cheap. And I'm in a position now where I'd rather not hold on to it alone. I've been thinking about partnering it out, letting somebody put some equity in alongside me, and we'd run it together and split the profit at the end of 3 or 5 years. I think it could be a real good thing for a young man with some savings and some ambition. I think it could be a good thing for both of us." He stopped. Silas was holding the shop rag in both hands. He was looking at Wendell Marsh the way he had looked at him through the diner window 2.5 years before, with a stillness that did not suggest agreement, and did not suggest disagreement, and did not suggest, in fact, anything that Wendell could read. Silas said, "No, thank you, sir." Wendell's smile flickered. Wendell said, "Son, I haven't even told you the terms." Silas said, "I don't need to hear the terms." Wendell said, "Well, listen, you're young. You're what, 21? You don't know what these kind of deals look like. I'm offering you a chance to be in business with me. There are men in this county who'd pay good money for that chance, and I'm walking up to your workshop on a Tuesday afternoon and putting it on the table for free." Silas said, "I understand that, Mr. Marsh." Wendell said then, "What the hell are you saving for, if not for something like this?" Silas looked at him for a long moment. He said, "Land." Wendell said, "What land?" Silas said, "Mine." Wendell Marsh did not say anything for several seconds. He stood there in his sport coat at the door of the Brandt workshop, and Silas watched the small calculations move behind his eyes, the rapid running through of what those two words might mean. What landmine said by a 21-year-old boy on a small farm east of Exeter to a man who had thought until that moment that he was the largest player in the county? Wendell said very carefully, "What land are you talking about, son?" Silas said, "That's not your business, sir." Wendell looked at him. For the first time in the conversation, the small, confident smile was gone from his mouth entirely. What was on his face now was a different expression. It was not quite anger. It was the expression of a man who had walked into a room expecting one kind of meeting and had found himself in a different kind of meeting, and who was beginning to recalculate in real time who he was actually dealing with. He said, "All right, Silas Brandt." He said it with a small, slow nod. Then he turned and walked back down the gravel drive to his Lincoln Continental. And he got in and he drove away. And Silas Brandt watched him go from the door of the workshop, and he understood, watching the dust come up behind the car on the gravel road, that he had just made an enemy who, until that afternoon, had only been a man he hated from a distance. He had made an enemy who was now going to be paying attention. He went back to the workshop. He picked up the hydraulic pump. He kept working. Through the spring and summer of 1981, Silas continued to work and save and watch the line on the passbook climb. And he did not see Wendell Marsh again that year. Not in the diner, not at the elevator, not anywhere in town. He did not entirely register the absence at the time. He understood it later. Something else happened that spring that Silas did not register at the time and did not understand until much later. Orville Taliver, who had been a strong and active man in November of 1980, when Silas had sat at his kitchen table and asked him for the contract, began somewhere in the late spring of 1981 to slow down. Silas saw him at the elevator 3 or 4 times that year. Each time he was a little thinner. His step had a small hesitation in it that had not been there before. His voice, when he spoke to Lloyd Pickett at the counter, had lost a little of its quiet weight. Silas, watching from across the office, did not know what was happening. The county did not know either, because Orville Taliver was not a man who told the county his business. He kept going to church on Sundays. He kept paying his bills. He kept doing the parts of the farm work that he could still do with Merrill Brandt now doing the heavier parts of it under the contract. He did not see a doctor in any town that anyone in Fillmore County knew about. He did not, as far as anyone could tell, change a single visible thing about the way he conducted his life. But he was getting smaller, slowly, every season. By the autumn of 1982, Orville Taliver had not been seen at the elevator in almost 3 months. Lloyd Pickett mentioned it once in passing to Silas. He said it was unlike Orville. He said somebody ought to drive out and check on him. Silas did not drive out. He did not, by the rule he had set himself, allow himself to drive out, because driving out would have looked like exactly what it would have been, which was the heir presumptive paying a final visit to the man whose land he intended to buy. Orville Taliver died on the 14th of October, 1982, alone in the white 2-story farmhouse at the end of the long gravel lane. He died in his sleep. He was 73 years old. The neighbor who found him the next morning called the county coroner, and the coroner called the estate attorney whose name was on the file at the Taliver place, which was a man in Fairbury named Cyril Mercer. 3 days later, Silas Brandt drove to the funeral at the Methodist Church in Exeter. He stood at the back. He did not speak to anyone. He did not go up to the casket. When the service was over, he walked out into the gravel parking lot, and he saw, standing by a dark blue sedan, a man in his late 50s in a charcoal suit who was making notes in a small leather pad. Silas walked past him without speaking. The man looked up. He saw Silas. He held Silas's eyes for 1 second with the mild, appraising look of a man who made his living reading rooms full of strangers, and then he went back to his notes. It was the first time Silas Brandt and Cyril Mercer had ever seen each other. Neither of them knew yet what the next 4 months were going to bring. 6 weeks later, in the second week of December 1982, the notice ran in the Exeter Courier. The Taliver property, 480 acres of dryland, would be sold by sealed bid auction on the 7th of February 1983. Bids were to be submitted in writing to the office of Cyril Mercer, attorney at law, in Fairbury, Nebraska by the 4th of February. Funds were to be verified at submission. The highest qualified bid would prevail. Silas read the notice on a Tuesday morning at the kitchen table while his mother was making coffee. He did not move. He did not change his expression. He folded the paper in half and put it down on the table. He drank his coffee. His mother, with her back to him, said quietly, "That's the Taliver place." Silas said, "Yes, it is." Adela Brandt did not turn around. She did not say anything else. Silas finished his coffee. He stood up. He put his cup in the sink. He put on his coat and his cap and his work gloves, and he walked out to the workshop, and he closed the door behind him. and he stood in the middle of the cold workshop floor for a long time alone. And he understood that the thing he had been working toward for 8 years and 4 months was finally, after all of it, in front of him. What he did not yet know, sitting in the workshop that morning with his work gloves still on his hands, was that one of the 4 other bidders who would file an envelope with Cyril Mercer's office over the next 8 weeks was going to be a man named Wendell Marsh, operating through a land partnership based in Omaha, with a bid carefully calibrated to sit just above the highest number that Wendell believed any 22-year-old boy in Fillmore County could possibly have saved. That number was $283,000. Silas Brandt sat down at the workbench in the cold. He took out a pencil and a piece of paper, and he began to do the math that the next part of this story is going to be about. The math was simpler than the 8 years that had led up to it. Silas sat at the workbench with the pencil and the paper, and the cold seeping in through the boards of the workshop wall. And he did not begin by asking himself what the other bidders were going to bid. He had spent 8 years deciding things by what was true, and not by what other people thought. And he had no intention of changing that method now in the last and most important calculation of his young life. He began instead by asking himself what the 480 acres of the Taliver place were worth. Worth to whom was the first question. Worth to a corporate buyer in Lincoln, the answer was one number. Worth to a speculator from Omaha, the answer was a different number. Worth to a man who had lived 4 miles east of that ground his whole life and had stood at the fence corner of that ground at 14 years old and had watched from a distance what Orville Taliver had done with that ground for 40 years. The answer was something else entirely. He thought about the tile drainage that Orville had put in along the low edges of the east field in 1963. He thought about the windbreaks of cedars on the northwest corners of the south paddock, planted in 1969, mature now, doing the slow, steady work of trapping snow and breaking the wind across the open ground. He thought about the soil records in the cabinet in the white 2-story farmhouse going back to 1948, which Orville had kept the way a doctor keeps notes on a patient he has been treating his whole life. He thought about the 34 years his own father had farmed 200 acres south of there, with a tenth of the care that Orville had given the 480. He wrote a number on the paper. He looked at it. He thought about what it would do to the timeline. If he bid that number and won, he would have $92,000 left in the account when the deed transferred. $92,000 was not nothing. It was, in fact, the cushion he had been carrying in his head for 2 years now, as the operating margin he would need to survive his first 2 seasons on the new ground without going to the bank. He thought about the promise to his mother in the gravel parking lot of First National in May of 1975. When you have it, whatever it is, it'll be paid for. He thought about the cushion. He drew a small line under the number and wrote it again with a small adjustment. $286,000. He looked at it for a long time. He understood that $286,000 was probably more than the corporate bidders from Lincoln were going to bid. He understood that it was probably more than the private buyer from Hastings was going to bid. He understood that it might well be more than the speculator partnership from Omaha was going to bid. He did not know, and he had no way of knowing what any of them were actually planning. He had not calculated the number to beat them. He had calculated it, to be honest. The land was worth $286,000 to a young man who intended to farm it with the same care that Orville Taliver had given it for 40 years. It was not worth less than that. It was not worth more than that. It was the number that when he handed it to Cyril Mercer in a sealed envelope on the morning of the 4th of February, he was going to be able to live with for the rest of his life. Regardless of how the bid came out, the winning, he thought, would be a side effect of the honesty. He did not know yet how right he was. In the last week of January 1983, Silas drove to Fairbury and met with Cyril Mercer in the wood-paneled office on Main Street. He brought with him the bank statements from First National, going back to August of 1975, 8 years and 5 months of monthly account history in chronological order in a manila envelope. Cyril Mercer was 58 years old that winter. He had handled 140 estate sales in 26 years of practice. He had in those years developed a reading of human beings that was nearly impossible to fool. And he had developed it not by being clever, but by being patient the way a man learns the surface of a particular field, by walking it for a long time. Silas placed the envelope on Cyril Mercer's desk. Cyril opened it. He did not say anything for almost 3 minutes. He went through the statements in order slowly with his reading glasses low on his nose. He noted the deposits in his head as he went. $40, $80, $120, $60, $200, $40 again, month after month, year after year. The slow, unbroken line of a young man who had committed himself to one thing and had not deviated from it in 8 years and 5 months. When he finished, he set the statements down on the desk and he removed his reading glasses and he looked at the 22-year-old man across from him. He said, "Son, may I ask you a question?" Silas said, "Yes, sir." Cyril said, "Why this farm?" Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I've been looking at it for 8 years. I know what it is." Cyril Mercer looked at him for a long moment. He had asked that question in some form of perhaps 90 estate buyers over his career, and he had received perhaps 90 different answers. He had never received the one Silas had just given him. He said, "All right." He took the statements. He took the bid envelope sealed and signed that Silas had also brought. He filed both of them in the manila folder for the Tolliver estate. He said the bids will be opened on the morning of February 7th in this office. The closing will follow at a date to be set. You don't need to be present at the opening. We'll notify the winner by telephone that afternoon. Silas said, "I'd like to be present if it's all right." Cyril said, "That's unusual." Silas said, "Yes, sir." Cyril looked at him for another moment. Then he said, "All right, you can be present." Silas drove home that afternoon in his pickup with the empty manila envelope on the passenger seat. The sky was the slow, flat gray of late January in Nebraska. He did not turn on the radio. He drove the 40 miles back to Exeter in silence, and when he got home, he parked the pickup in the yard and sat in the cab for a long time before he went inside, and what he was thinking while he sat there was that the 8 years were now down to 12 days. He did not tell anyone where he had been that afternoon. He did not tell his mother. He did not tell his father. He did not tell Jonas, who had begun slowly and without ceremony to speak to him again over the previous 2 years, and had reached by that winter a careful brotherly truce that did not yet involve full forgiveness. 12 days passed. On the morning of February 7th, 1983, at 8:45 in the morning, Silas Brandt drove to Fairbury in his pickup. He parked on the street outside Cyril Mercer's office. He walked into the small reception area in his good work clothes and his clean coat, and he sat down on the bench against the wall. 3 other men were already there. The corporate buyer from Lincoln, a man in his early 50s in a gray suit. The private buyer from Hastings, a man in his late 40s in a sport coat. The retired farmer from Crete, a man in his 60s in a denim jacket and a wool cap. A 5th man came in at 8:55. He was wearing a charcoal suit and good leather shoes and a watch that caught the light as he removed his coat. He was carrying a leather portfolio under one arm. Silas had not seen him in almost 2 years. It was Wendell Marsh. Wendell saw the 4 men in the reception area. His eyes moved across them, taking inventory. The Lincoln man, the Hastings man, the Crete farmer, and then on the bench by the wall, the 22-year-old in the work clothes whose hands were folded in his lap. Wendell stopped. For 1 second, his face did the thing that Silas had seen it do twice before. Once in the gravel parking lot of the Methodist church after Marin Whitlock's wedding, and once at the door of the Brandt workshop in April of 1981. The small recalculation, the recognition that the room was not the room he had assumed it was when he walked in. Then Wendell smiled. It was the smile of a man who had decided very quickly that the only acceptable response to surprise was to pretend that he had not been surprised. He said, "Silas Brandt, I didn't expect to see you here." Silas said, "No, sir, I imagine you didn't." Wendell said, "Are you here representing somebody?" Silas said, "No, sir. I'm here for myself." Wendell looked at him for another half-second. The smile stayed on. The eyes did something else. Then he said, "Well, good luck to you, son," Silas said, "and to you." Wendell sat down on the opposite bench. He took a folded newspaper out of his portfolio. He opened it to the financial page and began to read it with the careful, demonstrated calm of a man who wanted everyone in the room to see how unbothered he was. At 9 o'clock exactly, Cyril Mercer's secretary opened the inner door and called all 5 bidders in. The conference room was small. There was a long oak table in the middle of it. Cyril Mercer was seated at the head of the table with the manila folder of the estate file in front of him. To his right sat the notary public, a woman in her 50s named Helen Cosgrove. To his left sat the 2 surviving siblings of Orville Talliver, the sister from Omaha and the brother from Grand Island, both in their early 70s, both in their good Sunday clothes. The 5 bidders took their seats around the table. Cyril said, "Gentlemen, thank you for coming. We are gathered this morning to open the sealed bids for the estate of Orville Talliver. There are 5 qualified bids in the file. I will open them in ascending order of dollar value, as is my custom in these proceedings." He took the first envelope from the folder. He opened it. He read the name and the number. He said, "Carl Brennan, retired Crete, Nebraska. $244,000. The retired farmer in the wool cap nodded once. He had known he was not going to win. He had bid because he had wanted to bid. He sat back in his chair. Cyril took the second envelope. He opened it. He read. He said, "Daniel Pruitt, private buyer, Hastings, Nebraska. $258,000. The Hastings man let out a small breath. It was about what he had expected for second place. Cyril took the third envelope. He said, "Midland Agricultural Holdings, Lincoln, Nebraska. $271,000. The Lincoln man's face did not change. He had been told by his board to come in at $270. He had added $1,000 at the last minute. He had not won. He accepted this with the controlled neutrality of a man whose career was made of small expected losses. Cyril took the fourth envelope. The room had become very quiet. Wendell Marsh on the far side of the table was sitting with his newspaper folded on his lap and his hands flat on the table in front of him. He was watching Cyril Mercer's hands. He had stopped pretending to be calm. Cyril opened the envelope. He said, "Heartland Land Partners, LLC, Omaha, Nebraska, on behalf of Wendell Marsh and Associates. $283,000. Wendell's hands moved slightly on the table. The fingers spread very subtly the way the fingers of a man spread when he is preparing to stand up. He had bid $283. He had calculated on the basis of everything he knew about the boy on the other side of the table that $283 was $4,000 more than any 22-year-old in Fillmore County could possibly have saved. Cyril Mercer took the fifth envelope from the folder. He held it for 1 second longer than he had held the others. He looked at the seal. He looked at the front of it where the name was written in Silas Brandt's careful penciled hand. Then he looked across the table at Silas briefly, with no expression at all. He opened the envelope. He read the contents. He set the paper down on the table, and for a moment he did not say anything, and the room was so quiet that the small hum of the radiator in the corner became audible for the first time. Cyril said Silas Brandt of Fillmore County, Nebraska, $286,000. The room did not move for what felt to Silas like a very long time. Wendell Marsh's mouth opened slightly. He looked at Cyril. He looked at Silas. He looked at the paper on the table. He looked back at Cyril. He said, "That's wrong." Cyril said, "I beg your pardon, sir." Wendell said, "That bid is wrong. That boy doesn't have that money. There's no possible way that boy has that money. There's been a misfiling. There's been a fraud. I'd like to see the verification." Cyril Mercer did not raise his voice. He did not change his expression. He picked up the manila folder from the table. He removed from it the 8 years and 5 months of bank statements that Silas had brought to him in the last week of January. He laid them on the table in order and slid the stack down toward Wendell Marsh. He said, "Mr. Marsh, the funds were verified by First National Bank of Nebraska Exeter branch on the morning of January 31st. The verification was signed by the branch manager, Mr. Vance Holloway, with whom I believe you are acquainted. The deposits in the account go back to August of 1975. They are in order. They are continuous. They are real." Wendell looked down at the statements. The top sheet was the most recent. The balance line at the bottom right corner read $294,342. Wendell stared at the number. Then, slowly, he turned the page. The previous month, $289,000. He turned again. 284. He turned again. 279. He kept turning, pages and pages, year after year. The numbers got smaller as he went backward in time. 200,000, 150,000, 80,000, 40,000, 20,000, 5,000, $800, $380. The opening balance line. May 1975. $38. Co-signer Merrill Brandt. Account holder Silas Brandt, age 15. Wendell Marsh did not speak for almost 40 seconds. When he finally lifted his head, he was no longer looking at Cyril Mercer. He was looking across the table at Silas Brandt. He said, 8 years. Silas said, "Yes, sir." Wendell said, "You've been doing this since you were 15. Silas said, "Yes, sir." Wendell said, "Why?" Silas looked at him for a long moment. He did not answer the question. He did not need to. The answer was sitting in the bank. Statements between them on the table, and the answer was sitting in 8 years of small deposits made without explanation. And the answer was sitting in the shoulders of a man named Merrill Brandt, who had walked past a cluster of laughing men at a grain elevator in October of 1974, with his head down, because he had not been given the option of doing anything else. Silas did not say any of that. He just held Wendell Marsh's eyes across the table, and after a few seconds, Wendell looked away. The brother of Orville Taliver on the other side of the table said one thing. He was a heavy, quiet man named Howard Taliver, 70 years old, retired from the railroad, who had been listening to the entire proceeding in silence. He said Orville would have liked that. Cyril Mercer, in his careful, neutral voice, said yes. He would have. The brother nodded once. The sister from Omaha put her hand briefly on her brother's hand. Cyril Mercer turned to the notary public and asked her to record the winning bid, and Helen Cosgrove began to write in her ledger. And the proceeding by the small formal mechanism of estate law in the state of Nebraska was over. Silas Brandt, at the age of 22, on the morning of February 7, 1983, had won the right to purchase 480 acres of dryland in Fillmore County for $286,000 in certified funds, free and clear, with no cosigner, no inheritance, no bank, and no help. The other four bidders stood up. The Lincoln man came over and offered his hand, and Silas shook it. The Hastings man did the same. The retired farmer from Crete came over last, and he held Silas's hand for a longer moment, and he said without preamble, "Son, you did a remarkable thing." Then he put his cap on and walked out. Wendell Marsh did not offer his hand. He gathered his portfolio. He put on his coat with the slow, deliberate motion of a man who was being careful not to let his hands shake. He walked out of the conference room and through the reception area and out to the street, and he did not look at Silas as he passed. Silas remained at the table for a few more minutes to sign the documents that Cyril Mercer placed in front of him. The deed transfer was initialed in the presence of Helen Cosgrove. The closing date for the final transfer of certified funds was set for the morning of March 16, 1983, at which point the deed would be filed with the Fillmore County clerk. Cyril Mercer shook his hand at the door of the office, and he did not say anything more than was strictly required by the proceedings. But his eyes, when he met Silas's, said something that no words between them would have been adequate to. Silas walked out into the gray February morning. In the parking area of the office, Wendell Marsh was standing beside his Lincoln Continental with a cigarette between two fingers. He was not looking at the car. He was not looking at anything in particular. He was looking at the gravel. Silas walked across the lot toward his pickup. When he passed within 10 feet of the Lincoln, Wendell Marsh raised his head. The two men looked at each other for what could not have been more than 3 or 4 seconds. Wendell did not smile. He did not speak. What he did after a moment was nod. It was a small nod. It was a slow nod. It was the nod of a man who had spent 8 years and 4 months underestimating somebody, and who had just discovered in the worst possible way for him the size of the error. Silas, standing on the gravel of the parking lot in his work clothes, returned the nod with the same small slowness. Then he got into his pickup and drove home. The two men never spoke to each other again, as long as either of them lived. 4 years later, in the autumn of 1987, in the worst stretch of the farm crisis that hit the Central Plains, Wendell Marsh's Heartland land partners would default on 3/4 sections of leveraged ground in 2 counties, and Wendell himself would lose the insurance agency in Exeter and the 2-story house with the wraparound porch, and he would move to Lincoln to live near his older daughter, and he would, in the small, ordinary way of a man whose confidence had been the engine of his entire adult life, become a quieter and smaller person than he had been before. None of this would happen because of anything Silas Brandt did. It would happen because Wendell Marsh had built his life on leverage and had never in 50 years learned the lesson that a 14-year-old boy on a bicycle had taught himself in one summer afternoon. On the morning of March 16, 1983, 5 weeks after the bids had been opened, Silas Brandt drove back to Fairbury and did the thing he had been working toward for 8 years and 4 months. He laid the certified funds draft on Cyril Mercer's desk. The room went quiet in that particular way that grown men go quiet when they are watching something they had not believed could be done, get done. The certified funds draft was made out for $286,000. It was certified by the First National Bank of Nebraska Exeter branch. It was real money. It was paid in full. And the young man holding it was 22 years old. The deed was recorded with the Fillmore County clerk that same afternoon. By sundown, 480 acres of dryland in south-central Nebraska belonged to Silas Brandt, free and clear in a way that no bank could ever take back. On the 1st of April, 1983, Silas Brandt moved into the white two-story farmhouse at the end of the long gravel lane. He took with him the contents of his bedroom in the Brandt house, 2 changes of work clothes, 1 good suit, the small spiral notebook he had been keeping since he was 17, the blue passbook, a photograph of his parents from their wedding day in 1958, a second photograph of his mother and his brother at the kitchen table the previous Christmas, taken by Adela herself, with the small Kodak camera she kept in the drawer of the sideboard. Nothing else. His father drove out that afternoon. Merrill Brandt parked the pickup at the end of the gravel lane. He stood in the yard. He looked east toward the long, unbroken stretch of dryland winter wheat that ran out to the horizon. He looked at the windbreaks of cedars on the northwest corners of the south paddock. He looked at the 2-story house that he had been doing custom work around for 2.5 years, and had never set foot inside until that afternoon. He stood in the yard for a long time before he spoke. When he finally turned to his son, his face had something on it that Silas had not seen on his father's face in 22 years of being alive. It was not pride exactly. It was something more difficult than pride. It was the particular expression of a man who was being shown very late in his own life that the work he had been doing for 35 years had produced an outcome he had not been able to imagine. Merrill said, "Son." He said it once. He did not finish the sentence. Silas waited. Merrill said, "When did you decide to do this?" Silas said, "The night I heard you and Mom at the kitchen table. July of 1974. I was upstairs. I couldn't sleep. The window was open. Merrill Brandt stood very still. He said, "What did you hear?" Silas said, "I heard everything, Dad." Merrill closed his eyes. He kept them closed for a long moment. When he opened them again, the wetness on his lashes was the only sign that anything had moved in him. He said, "Silas, you should have told me, son." Silas said, "No, sir. I don't think I should have." Merrill said, "Why?" Silas said, "Because if I had told you, you would have made me give you the money to save the place. I know you would have. You couldn't have stopped yourself. And then I would have spent the next 30 years watching you try to repay it. And it would have killed something between us that I didn't want killed." Merrill Brandt sat down. He sat down on the bottom step of the porch of the farmhouse he had not been able to buy in 16 years. The porch of a different farmhouse that his son had now bought in 8. And he put his face in his hands. And he did not cry exactly, but his shoulders moved. Silas sat down on the step beside him. They did not say anything else for a long time. The wind came across the wheat from the west. Adela Brandt drove out the next afternoon with a covered apple pie on the seat of the family car. She had not been out to the Talliver place before in all the years she had lived 4 miles from it. She parked in the gravel beside the porch. She walked up to the front door with the pie in her hands and her good coat buttoned against the April cold. Silas met her at the door. She came inside. She walked through the rooms of the white 2-story farmhouse with the slow, careful step of a woman who was trying to take in a thing too large to take in all at once. The kitchen with its long oak table where Orville and Lavinia Talliver had eaten 3 meals a day for 40 years. The front room with its brick fireplace and the heavy curtains Lavinia had sewn. The narrow stairs going up to the 4 bedrooms on the second floor. She came back to the kitchen. She set the pie on the long oak table. Silas said, "I have something to show you, Mom." He went to the small desk in the corner of the kitchen, and he opened the top drawer, and he took out the deed. He brought it back to the table. He laid it on the wood beside the pie. He smoothed it once with the flat of his hand. He said, "It's paid for." Adela Brandt looked down at the deed. She did not pick it up. She did not read it. She had not been asked to read it. She had been asked in the gravel parking lot of First National Bank of Nebraska in May of 1975 to receive a promise. The deed was the promise. She put one hand on the paper. She did not say anything. After a moment, the tears came. They came quietly, the way most things came in the Brandt family. She did not make a sound. The tears ran down her face and onto the collar of her good coat, and she stood beside the long oak table in the kitchen of the white 2-story farmhouse, with one hand on a paper that said, her son owned 480 acres of dryland free and clear. And she did not say a single word. And Silas Brandt, watching her from across the room, understood that the 8 years had been worth it. Not for the land. Not for the silencing of Wendell Marsh. Not for the proving of any point. They had been worth it for this. For the moment when his mother's hand had been able to rest on a paper and she had not had to say anything. Jonas drove out the second week of June. He had not seen the new place yet. He had not, in fact, said anything to Silas about the auction or the deed or the move in the 2 months since it had happened. The careful brotherly truce of the previous 2 years had survived the news, but it had not yet expanded to absorb it. Silas met him in the yard. The two of them walked east along the lane to the edge of the south paddock. The wheat was up to their knees, and turning the deep green it turned before it began to head out. They walked in silence for a long time. At the fence corner, Silas stopped. He said, "Jonas." Jonas said, "Yeah." Silas said, "There's another account." Jonas said, "What?" Silas said, "At First National. It's smaller than the one you knew about. I started it in 1979. Mom doesn't know about it. Dad doesn't know. It's for school. There's enough in it for the rest of your degree at Lincoln plus some." Jonas did not say anything. Silas said, "I should have told you in 1980. I couldn't. I'm telling you now." He did not look at his brother while he said it. He looked east across the wheat, the way Orville Talliver had looked east across the same wheat for 40 years. Jonas beside him did something that Silas had not heard his brother do since they were small children. He cried. Not the wounded crying of the workshop in 1980. A different kind. The kind a young man cries when something he has been carrying alone for a long time is finally taken out of his hands. Silas put his arm around his brother's shoulders. They stood at the fence corner in the June sun with the wheat moving slowly in the wind. Neither of them said anything else. In September of 1983, almost 6 months after the move, Silas was going through the last of Orville Talliver's filing cabinet in the small office off the kitchen. He had been working through the cabinet slowly in the evenings, learning the records that Orville had kept. He had moved most of the way through the soil files and the equipment files and was beginning on the personal correspondence drawer, when near the back of a file marked simply "Notes" he found an envelope addressed to no one. It was unsealed. Inside it was a single sheet of paper in Orville Talliver's handwriting. The date at the top was November 14th, 1980. Silas read it. It said on this date, a young man named Silas Brandt sat at this kitchen table and asked me to do a thing he could have done himself. He could have given his father the money. He has the money. I do not know how I know this, but I know it the way a man knows the look of his own ground from the road. He chose instead to ask me to do the thing in a way that would let his father keep what could not be paid for in dollars. I have watched this young man for some years now. I have watched him at the elevator. I have watched him at church. I have watched the way he handles equipment that does not belong to him. I do not know what he is working toward in his life. I do not need to know. If in some season I will not be here for this farm should pass into his hands, I want it on record that I considered the prospect and that I considered it good. The land would be safe with him. So I want it written here where someone may or may not find it. I have not told him. I will not tell him. Some things should stay between two men who never need to speak of them. Below this, Orville had signed his name. Silas read the page 3 times. He did not move from the desk for a long time. Then he stood up. He carried the page to the brick fireplace in the front room. He laid a small fire in the grate the way he had been doing in the evenings, as the September air had started to cool. He lit it with a single match. He held the page over the flame for a moment. Then he laid it on the burning wood. The paper caught. It curled. The handwriting blackened and broke apart and became smoke that went up the chimney into the September sky over Fillmore County. And Silas Brandt watched it go. And what he was thinking while he watched was a thing he would not have been able to say out loud to anyone but that he was certain of all the way down. Some things should stay between two men who never need to speak of them. He had been one of those two men. The other had been Orville Talliver. The thing that had passed between them had passed in silence, and in silence it would remain. And the only honest thing to do with the written record of it now, that one of the two men was in the ground, was to let the silence finally close over it for good. He went back to the office. He closed the filing cabinet. He never opened that drawer again. Cyril Mercer drove out to the farm in the second week of August of that year. He had not made any prior arrangement. Silas saw the dark blue sedan come up the gravel lane in the late afternoon, and he met the older man in the yard. The two of them walked east along the lane. They walked in silence for most of the way in the manner of two men who had said most of what was necessary to say between them already. At the fence corner, Cyril stopped. He said, "Silas." Silas said, "Sir." Cyril said, "The man from Lincoln called me last week." Silas said, "The corporate buyer." Cyril said, "Yes." He said he wanted to know who had submitted the winning bid. He said he had been in this business for 20 years, and he wanted to know what kind of buyer had walked away with that ground. I told him the buyer was a local man who had been planning the purchase for 8 years. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, 8 years. And I said, yes. And he said, I have been in this business 20 years, and I have never waited 8 years for anything. Silas did not say anything. Cyril said, I told him that may be the difference. The afternoon wind moved through the heads of the wheat. Silas Brandt looked at the 480 acres of his own ground running away to the horizon. He thought about the bicycle on the morning of August 1974. He thought about the kitchen table on the night before that. He thought about Wendell Marsh in the parking lot with the cigarette and the slow nod. He thought about his mother's hand on the deed on the long oak table. He thought about Jonas at the fence corner in June. He thought about Orville Talliver, who had watched him for some years and had decided that the watching was good, and who had taken the watching with him into the ground without ever letting him know. He did not say anything to Cyril Mercer. He did not need to. The land had already said it, By 1991, Silas Brandt owned 640 acres in Fillmore County, all paid in cash. By 1995, he owned 800. By 2003, he owned 1,040. He never borrowed against any of it. He never took an operating loan. He never refinanced. His mother lived to see him become the largest unmortgaged landholder in the county. She died in 2011 in the upstairs bedroom of the Talliver farmhouse at the age of 79, and her last words to Silas, with one hand on his hand and the other on the quilt she had brought with her from the Brandt place when they had moved her in, were, "You kept the promise, son." Merrill Brandt died in 2007. He had farmed the original Brandt place until the last year of his life with Silas's help and equipment, paying the place off in 1998. With a final payment of $41,000 that he made in person at the counter of First National Bank of Nebraska in front of Vance Holloway, who shook his hand without comment. Jonas Brandt graduated from the University of Nebraska in 1986 with a degree in agronomy. He worked for the Agricultural Extension Service in 3 counties for 30 years. He retired in 2019. He visits Silas every Sunday for dinner. Silas Brandt is 64 years old. As I tell you this, he has been married since 1989 to a woman named Eleanor Pruitt, the daughter of the Hastings buyer who had bid $258,000 at the auction in 1983. Their oldest son, Tobias Brandt, is 31 years old. Tobias farms the eastern 800 acres alongside his father. Tobias has memorized the soil records that Orville Talliver kept from 1948 to 1982. Tobias has begun a 3rd filing cabinet, picking up where his father's filing cabinet left off. The 3 cabinets sit side by side in the office off the kitchen of the white 2-story farmhouse at the end of the long gravel lane. Together they hold 76 years of continuous observation of the same 480 acres of dryland in south-central Nebraska, kept by 3 different men who never met in person across the same lifetime, but who understood, all 3 of them, the same thing about farm ground: that it rewards attention paid honestly and without shortcuts, and that the reward is not immediate. The most powerful thing a man can decide in this country, in any year of any decade, is what he is willing to wait for in silence. Because the things you can wait for without telling another living soul are the things you actually believe in. Everything else is just talk. The land knows the difference. And eventually, if you are quiet long enough and patient long enough and stubborn enough about what is true, the people who were watching you all along will know it too.